Welcome back to the project. Today we are finally going to be doing all the finishing. And by finishing, I mean the staining and polyurethane, but either way, this was a very long process, so buckle up. Let me start off by saying that this took me a lot of time, like way more than I initially planned for. I started this with 1 or 2 weeks left in October, and I didn't finish this till like the middle of November. So a lot of this was me just kind of waiting for a nice warm day to be able to do different coats. But with that in mind, the first two things that I'm going to point out are that 1, you need pretty good and moderate weather to do this, and number 2, that it takes up a lot of space because you have to physically lay out every single board or panel that you have. Anything that can be visible at the same time in the end product. So here is like all the outside facing boards. I recommend doing the finishing at the same time. That way they have the same temperature, humidity, sun exposure. They get to cure for the same amount of time. And in theory, that should give you a more consistent color in the end product. Now, if you do it on different days, it might not make that big of a difference, but if you have different enough conditions, you could notice a slight variation on the shade of one board relative to the other. If you haven't already watched it, the episode where I stained just the frame of the bed, I said I did a lot of experimenting already with literally scrap pieces from this bed set, so I knew it was the same wood, and I tried out a few different finish techniques to find one that worked for me. So what I really suggest is that you try whatever you want to do on your own, just see what works well for you and with the actual wood that you're using. But for me, that was 1 coat of a wood conditioner, and I used a Varathane wood conditioner, followed by 2 coats of the Watco dark walnut Danish oil. Now I'm also doing a polyurethane on top later, but as far as just the base coat and the stain, that gave me the color and the consistency I liked. It pretty much matched the color perfectly with everything else that I've already have done, and the way it soaked into the wood was just deep enough that I think it's going to be a more lasting finish than some of the other things that I tried. But because I know that you're not going to play around with finishes on your own because you're probably going to be lazy, here's what I'll also suggest, and that is start on the side of these boards that you are not going to see in the end product. That way, if you find out that you're terrible at this and that it doesn't look good, you know what you did wrong on a side that you're not going to have to look at every day. Now, staining is not particularly hard. I've done another video that I'll link below that goes over how to do it, but if you've never done it before, don't start on something that you're going to see every time you go to bed and every time you wake up. Just put it on something that'll be on the inside surface. Now, one other thing that I want to point out that I realized while I was doing this is I put on stain a little bit heavy, so I get like a little bit of extra that kind of flows over the side sometimes. Because some of these boards are doweled together, that is not like a stain tight seal. So some of the stain can drip through and go onto the other side of the board. So be careful when you're doing those boards. And if you need to, flip it over and spread out that stain as quickly as you can, especially if you're starting with the inside surface first. Otherwise, in the final product, you will see that area wherever it puddled up. It will be a little bit darker because it did get an extra coat of stain. Now, realistically, it doesn't take a lot of time after you apply it before you can either flip this thing over and hit the other side or do the second coat. So what I would recommend is that if you get a bunch on here and it starts leaking through to the other side, just coat the other side right away, get the whole thing nice and even, and then whatever side is going to face in on the end product, put that side facing down, touching these little boards that I have holding it off of the table. In the event those boards leave a mark, which is pretty uncommon, if it's on the inside, you're never going to see it. Whereas if you have 2 stripes on the outside, you're going to be pretty pissed at yourself every time that you see them. But after I got 2 coats on everything, I gave it about 30 minutes to an hour, so it set up just enough that I could handle it. I moved everything into my garage, and then it actually ended up sitting in my garage for a full week simply because it rained for most of the week, so I really didn't have the right weather to work on it. As a quick side note here, even though I waited a week because that's how the weather lined up, you don't necessarily need to wait that long, but whatever finish you apply should have directions on it that say how many hours it needs to off-gas and to cure prior to applying a top coat. Otherwise, it could mess up the top coat, it might not cure properly, there could just be other implications. For mine, I believe it said either 24 or 48 hours, and that depended on if you were using a water-based versus an oil-based polyurethane. But even if the weather is lining up for you and you're just trying to be really careful, wait a week, it's not going to hurt anything. And again, everything that you do to get this right now is going to show in the quality of your finished product. But for me, the wait gave me an opportunity to do a final dry fit of the sides prior to doing the polyurethane on this. So let's jump into that a little bit. All I did for this final dry fit check was lay out everything exactly like it's going to be in the final product. This is the exact orientation it had when we did the dry fit to sand everything to make sure it was flush. But if you remember a few episodes back, on one side, when you squeezed all of the drawer faces up towards the head of the bed, there's about a 1/8 of an inch gap, and the other side was really tight. Now that we had bad weather for about a week, all these boards expanded because of the humidity. So the side that had an 1/8 inch gap no longer really had a gap. Now it wasn't really hanging out at the end, but it just no longer had the gap there. Whereas the other side had no gap, now it was sticking out a little bit past the end. So when I played with this for a little bit and I did a couple little tests, those drawers would have been too wide, so every time I opened or closed them, they would have been dragging on both outside edges, and they probably wouldn't have closed smoothly because they would have caught all the other faces around them. Now honestly, that's going to hide the gap a lot if you want these drawers to be really discreet, but no one's going to notice a 1/16 of an inch gap anyhow. But you are definitely going to notice that it is physically difficult to open and close these drawers, and it is going to annoy the crap out of you. So what I decided to do was trim down one of the boards, and I trimmed down the board for the drawer face that was going to be nearest the head of the bed. By doing it on the edge of the board that's closest to the wall, there's almost no chance I will ever have an angle at which I can see that when this is in normal use. So again, think about the orientation of everything in the final product. Think about how it's going to be laid out in the room. If you need to make a cut, you need to trim something down like I do here, think about where you should place that so that it doesn't bother you and it doesn't look bad, or if it does look bad, you just don't have to look at it. I took that board out on both sides of the bed. I trimmed them both down just a little bit, and then once again I break out the sander, again just trying to break the sharp edge from the cut that we just made with the miter saw. After I was happy with it, a quick wipe with a microfiber towel to clean up any of the extra dust that was on it, then just refinish it like we did everything else, the 1 coat of wood conditioner and the 2 coats of the Danish oil. As for the drawers themselves, kind of the guts of this whole thing, I had a maple plywood for the bottom. I think the color of a natural maple is really good, but I didn't want to have too much contrast between that and the rest of the sides of the drawer. So for that reason, I decided to leave the entire inside unstained, and I was only going to polyurethane it so it was a little bit more durable and long lasting. When I did my final dry fit of the drawers, I found that the slot that I cut on all those drawer sides wasn't quite wide enough to account for 2 things. First being the drawer thickness with the added thickness of the polyurethane, and 2, the bowing on the bottom of the plywood pieces, which I showed a few episodes ago. The humidity made it even worse, and as much as I tried, I could not get those to flatten out. So to make it work, I cut these channels the slightest bit wider, and it was enough that I could fit the plywood in, but not so much that it would have the full bow that it naturally wanted to do. It was a little bit constrained on the top and bottom, and it still provided very minimal gap. That's really the trick to getting good fit and finish. You want it to have a little bit of space. You don't want it to have so much space that there is a visible gap the whole way around. The polyurethane will help fill it in a little bit, but you can always take more material off. You cannot add more material back on. If you cut too much, you gotta remake the drawer side. Just keep that in mind. Or more realistically, you can just take the lazy way out and have really bad fitment on one area that you will always know about and that will bother you in the back of your mind. At this point, I was finally happy with all the dry fitting, so I was ready to start polyurethaning. I think it said there was a 5 to 7% chance of rain, and it was only for an hour of this day, but because I was trying to do finish work, that means it was immediately a 100% chance of rain. I don't know why. That is just always how my luck plays out. And again, I don't really have a shop to do this in, so I had to do it outside. And even though it was only a very light sprinkle, I stopped applying polyurethane the second it started raining because I didn't want to waste it. You could distinctly make out every single drop of rain and where it hit after I let this dry. So jumping forward a little bit here, I had to sand all of that polyurethane off to get all of those spots out and then restart from the beginning. This is why the project and the finishing took me so long, is I could not risk having inclement weather while doing this because I knew how much work was involved if I had to do this over. The reality is having to strip all this stuff back down, because that's the only way to get rid of those spots, that is a ton of extra work that is very time consuming. If you take a dice roll on a kind of cloudy day, you could spend 3 or 4 afternoons of just spare time if you're just doing this on the side, just trying to restrip everything down even with an orbital sander. Or you could just wait another 2 days where you know it's going to be clear weather in the forecast, and even though you waited those 2 days, you'll still be a day or 2 ahead of where you would be if you had to restrip everything down. So as much as it might seem like you're trying to get this done now and you need to get it done, it is not worth the risk. Just take my word on it. The fact that it said 0% chance of rain during this hour where it rained absolutely killed me, and that was a huge deficit to the timeline of this project. If you're trying to be an optimist here, the polyurethane does raise the grain of the wood anyhow, so there's going to be parts that are a little bit more rough because the grain is going to be raised up after you put on the first really light coat of polyurethane. So on the plus side, you're going to have to sand it out anyway. I was still just really pissed off about the rain. But I'm just block sanding here. I'm literally using a piece of 2x4 with some sandpaper, but if you want, you can buy the fancy one from Home Depot or whatever. And as far as grit, I started with a 150 grit just to get those really high spots out where the grain was really raised. And eventually you're going to work up to that 180 to 220 grit that we like to use for the finished product. But as you're doing the polyurethane, you're doing coat after coat after coat, any imperfections you have at the start are probably just going to compound into the end product. So it's going to be a lot harder to take it out later than it is to take it out now. So I started with a block sand on all these, then to get a really nice finished polish almost to it, I used a very fine steel wool. This is a 4/0, which is just 4 zeros. I don't know why it's called aughts. Quick disclaimer is that you only need a double aught or a 2-0. I'm using a 4/0 because it's way more fine and it gives you a much smoother final product. But again, be as picky or as not picky as you really please. This is your bed set, not mine. Do whatever you want. And to clean up the dust at the end, I'm using a microfiber towel. You can also use a tack cloth, but almost all of this finish is going to be by feel. You almost have to do this with your fingertips. Just run your fingertips along the entire thing from one edge to the other. Wherever your fingers suddenly start to snag or you feel a rough spot, that's where you should focus on. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on how to apply polyurethane. I'll link a video in the description below. That is actually the one that I learned from. That one was super detailed. I cannot do a better job explaining it than how that guy does, but as a fair warning, it is a fairly long video. But for someone like me looking for absolute perfection who really needed that level of detail, that video is well worth the watch time. So just keep that in mind if you are interested in doing this. And after the polyurethane dried on those bottom pieces of plywood, I found that when I flipped them over, I put a little bit too much on that first coat and a little bit of it dripped down and created these little nodules on the backside, these little like raised sections. So I've got the orbital sander here with, I believe it was a 120 grit, just to take all of those high spots down on the back. I'm not worried about seeing those in the end product because it's going to be the underside of the drawer, but I am worried about those affecting how this fits into the slot we cut on the drawer sides. And at this point, for all the drawer bottoms, all the drawer sides, and all the sides of the bed, it is going to be a rinse and repeat. You start with a nice light coat of polyurethane, you raise the grain, you spend a little bit more time sanding down that initial layer, then you go to the 4/0 steel wool, then you apply another coat of polyurethane, and the first coats are going to be a little thinner, and as you go on, your coats will get a little heavier and a little heavier. And again, you want to watch out for runs, you want to watch out for high spots. You can watch the reflection of this in the light. That'll tell you where you're getting a little bit of puddling or pooling, and then use your brush to just spread those areas out. That's kind of the only tip that I figured out doing this that wasn't mentioned in the other video that I linked below. Now, if you're looking for the quick and dirty on how to apply polyurethane, don't shake it. Always just stir it gently. Do as little as you can possibly do to introduce bubbles into it while you're mixing it up. Do as little as possible to transfer containers. Again, you don't want bubbles in it. Then I pretty much saturated the brush. I put it on really heavy in the middle, and then I went from the middle out to both ends, and then at the very end, I did a full pass from one edge of the board all the way down to the other. The drawer bottoms, those are literally going to be inches off the floor. You are never going to see those. I wanted to seal those for durability and to make sure this thing wasn't expanding and contracting too much with weather and humidity changes. But because it's not the finished surface, if you're just looking for a sealant, 1 to 2 medium thickness coats of polyurethane should be enough for most people on that. On everything else, because I was going for such perfection, I sanded down a lot between layers, and I mean a lot, like a lot more than I ever anticipated, and I was getting to the point seasonally that I had to take every single chance I could to apply it because the temperatures were dropping lower and lower every day. So I took up my entire garage to really make use of this space, but if you're planning ahead and you know you're doing this project ahead of time, you can polyurethane things in sections, so doing only the outside faces first and then doing only the drawers, that is totally an option if you still want to go with the phased approach. One other tip that I have that could make your life a little bit easier is that I was running these box fans with filters on the back to take as much dust out of the air as possible. Like I said, you're going to be sanding this a lot between coats. That puts a lot of dust in the air. All those little dust granules, they will land in the polyurethane while it's curing, and then at the end, when you run your hand over it, you will be able to feel pretty much every speck of dust that lands in this thing. Now, it's usually not too bad. Every now and then you'll get one that's a little bit big, but that's why I spent so much time making sure the air was filtered out and so much time sanding between coats, waiting for the dust to settle, cleaning everything off thoroughly with a microfiber before applying the next coat. When doing the finish work like this, a little bit of dust control goes a long way to making your life a lot easier. I think I did somewhere between 5 and 7 coats on everything. Make sure you get the nooks and crannies. Make sure you get the edges of the boards, especially those face boards, because one of them is going to face up towards the top of the bed. And also make sure you watch out for runs, especially on those top boards where it's going to go over to the other side where you can see it on the inside edge of the bed. And just like with the stain at the beginning, the polyurethane can also drip through those dowel joint connections. Keep that in mind as well. Now, what I would do on some of these is wait till it was partially cured, but those big globules didn't have enough time to cure yet, and I would just pick them off really quickly, either by running my finger along them or using like my thumbnail or a razor blade or something. But after the first few coats, you should get enough practice that you're no longer creating them in the first place, but it is going to take you a little bit of time to get to that point. Speaking of time, like I said, this is probably one of the longest parts of the project. This one part took me several weeks, mostly just because it was waiting for everything to cure. This was a lot of late nights and a lot of early mornings so that I could maximize the good weather I had, because like I said, we were getting to early mid-November at this point in New Hampshire. That is not necessarily a good season for doing outside projects. With all this in mind, if you're willing to put in the work, you're willing to get this done, you will eventually come out on the other side with an excellent end product. Now, I'm using a glossy polyurethane. I wanted to keep that nice glossy look. When you get to the very, very last coat, you're going to want to sand it. Don't sand it unless you also want to break out a polisher. You might notice that you still feel some of those little like dust nibs that are stuck in it. One of the tricks from the video that I linked below is that you don't use the steel wool, you don't use sandpaper to take all those out at the very end. Use a brown paper bag. Literally just use the brown paper bag as sandpaper. Don't press hard into it. Don't use the block. Just with your finger pressure, very, very light, run over all those dust nibs, all of those rough spots on the final coat after it's cured, and you will take out all of those small imperfections. And especially if you've done all the correct sanding in between your coats, you know, like I've been telling you to do for the last however many minutes this video is, this finish will absolutely blow you away. I've never polyurethaned this many coats on this large of a piece of furniture. I've done coffee tables and end tables. I've done a couple other things here and there. This is by far the most coats and the most surface area I have ever covered in a single project. Even so, this blew away anything else I have ever done as far as finish is concerned. So if you take your time, if you do it right, and if you put in the effort, these things will come out absolutely incredible. Even just looking at this finish with the glossy polyurethane on it, just look at how much this wood pops and how vibrant it looks. Just look at the transformation. This is before and this is after. It's not color edited, it's not more saturated, it's literally just that much more vibrant that even with no color correction, this wood looks phenomenal. And I would know, I've seen quite a bit of wood in my day. I probably can't say that. Anyway, back to talking about the polyurethane. In my opinion, this was the biggest hurdle of the entire project. This is where the most attention to detail was needed, and I think the results really reflect the amount of effort and the amount of time that was put in here. I moved some of the finished boards into the room just so they could acclimate to the environment before doing the final install. And with that said, we have made it through the biggest flaming hula hoop in this project, and we are ready for the home stretch. So we'll resume next time when we can assemble the drawers and do the final assembly for the whole bed. Hopefully you guys are as excited to see the end product as I was when I was doing this. I want to thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.